of Iran's nuclear development history. Starting with the Shah. The Shah was obsessed with having Iran become a modern country and a country that could follow in its great tradition of Iranian empire that ruled a good part of the world in the 5th century BC. He saw the introduction of technology as being crucial for creation of a modern country. And in that context, nuclear technology was the ultimate technology for a modern state. So he was extremely proactive in promoting nuclear development in Iran from an early time. He also advocated nuclear development as part of the economic planning and development of Iran. So it was in terms of national pride and pragmatic economic development. Iran got started with its nuclear programs through the assistance of the United States. In 1967, the United States provided Iran with a research reactor under the Atoms for Peace program. In 1968, Iran was the first non-nuclear country to sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Agreement. Under that agreement, Iran gained the right to enrich uranium under the safeguards of the International Atomic Energy Agency. As part of the Shah's initiative for nuclear power development, in 1976, he announced a program to build 23 large nuclear power plants in Iran and sent many Iranians for training programs throughout the United States, including a massive education program at MIT. But those plans did not come to fruition since in 1979 the Shah was removed from power by the Islamic Revolution that took place. However, after a pause, the Ayatollahs realized that for economic reasons, they needed to continue the development of nuclear power. And they supported nuclear development and entered into contracts first with Germany and then with Russia to start building nuclear power plants. But as of today, only one nuclear power plant has been built in Iran and became operational in 2011. So today, Iran has one nuclear power plant, but thousands of centrifuges that are enriching uranium. As you know, natural uranium cannot be used in a bomb. The uranium needs to be processed to separate out the fissionable component of the natural uranium, which is only less than 1% of the uranium that comes out as ore. And so it's a complex and difficult process. But Iran is moving full steam in that direction. And it should be noted that Iran is still part of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Agreement. However, they've been judged non-compliant by the Security Council of the United Nations, and they have been subjected to severe economic sanctions by the United States. The question is, how can this standoff be resolved peacefully? And so I turn to our panelists to hear from them, and we start with Professor Mostashari.
Sure, thanks Ed, and thanks to the Whitehair Journal staff for organizing this. I think this is a timely panel. Such panels are taking place all over the U.S. People are talking about this issue from different perspectives. What I think I can offer, which might be a bit different than the usual discussion, is actually looking at this entire issue from the Iranian perspective. So what does how does the Iranian state view all this, and what's their objective? A favorite quote of mine by Eleanor Roosevelt is, small minds talk about people, mediocre minds about events, and great minds about ideas. The parallel of that in international affairs is like crappy analysts talk about news, mediocre analysts talk about strategy and action, and probably great analysts think about objectives of actors before you can think about the details. So you really need to understand why international actors act the way they do, and you need to understand it not from your own perspective, you need to understand it from their perspective and from their context. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to offer 6 points that I think are good, important takeaways, looking at this entire issue from the Iranian perspective. And this is something you're not going to hear that often because everyone looks at it from the international community's perspective, assuming that everyone knows what Iran wants. And I actually would challenge that. For one, so as Ed said, the relationships between the U.S. and Iran have been strained for a long period of time, since '53, when the coup took place against the democratically elected government in Iran. It culminated in the U.S. hostage crisis in 1979. You probably might have seen the film Argo. It was historically inaccurate, but still, it was, I mean, from a point of fiction perspective, it was very well done. It allows you to have a glimpse into that era in general. And essentially, immediately after the hostage crisis, Saddam Hussein attacked Iran in 1980, and bloody war broke out between Iran and Iraq in 81, actually. And at that time, because of the hostage crisis and because of the fear that the West had about Iran trying to export its Islamic revolution. It was actually the first Islamic revolution, or Islamic anything in terms of political Islamic power assertion that we'd seen. And at that time, because of that fear, the entire Western Hemisphere was supporting Saddam Hussein through provision of weapons, including chemical weapons, which were provided by Germany, and many satellite pictures. And so in the war, during that war, the people who, there were two types of military in Iran. There was the traditional military, conventional military, which was essentially trained at West Point prior to the revolution. And there was the Revolutionary Guard, which were ragtag people, more ideological types, who weren't really militarily trained, but they were kind of very passionate about defending their country and defending their regime. Those Revolutionary Guard types, who started out from ragtag commanders, later on became the generals and the senior military officials that you see right now taking power in Iran. And their experience of the West and their phobia of the West dates back to the Iran-Iraq War, when Iran was essentially alone against the rest of the world in that particular war, which was essentially also a war. So it was an invasion of Iran at the time. So it was, in a sense, and it was the same thing that Saddam did to Kuwait, he did to Iran, but at that time, because of the revolutionary nature of Iran, it received a different treatment. Now, understanding that mindset is important to understand the mindset of the Revolutionary Guard commanders, who today are standing up against the U.S. They do not trust the U.S., they do not trust Western powers in general, and they do believe that they need to essentially rely on their own for their own security. The only country, actually, that supported Iran during the Iran-Iraq War with provision of weapons, which country do you think that country was? Israel. Only country that supported Iran during the Iran-Iraq War for 8 years was Israel. The Iran-Contra affair actually was an interesting issue that came up. The U.S. government would provide Israel with weapons. These were surplus weapons. The Israelis didn't need them. They would sell them to the Iranians for oil. And then some of the money, because this was an illegal act, would actually flow directly to the Contras in Nicaragua to support their fight against the communists in Nicaragua. It was a very weird affair, but international affairs is actually quite kind of complex, so you really need to understand it. And these are really fun stories when time passes, but at the time when you're actually within them, they can be very tragic. But afterwards, of course, everything becomes kind of comical. So relationships with Israel, between Iran and Israel, at the height of the Iranian Revolution, Israel and Iran had really good relations, at least in a clandestine way, where Israel was providing Iran with weapons. And at the same time, there were people in marches, the revolutionary marches in Iran would say death to Israel, and at the same time they were getting Israeli weapons. And that's how the world actually works. I mean, it's the way nations have relationships. And then there's no real hatred of Israel. Iran has never had any real problem, cannot have real problems with Israel because it doesn't border Israel. It's really not, the country has not been an anti-Semitic country. Actually, among the countries in the Middle East, it hosts the largest population of Jewish people, close to 60,000 still remaining, despite the fact that the revolution wasn't really good to them. A lot of them left. They came to Southern California and to actually Long Island here close to New York. And a few of them went to Israel actually because they thought Israel was a socialist state. They didn't want to pay too much taxes, so they came to Southern California. But the thing is, so there's no real anti-Semitism within the larger history of Iran. In fact, Cyrus, which was a Persian king, is one of the Mashayikh within the Bible. So he's one of the saviors of the Jewish people. So there isn't that. So there isn't any territorial conflict. There is no inherent conflict. So where does the hostility come from between Iran and Israel? Well, it's actually all geared towards Iran's internal domestic politics. It has nothing to do with Israel. It is the fact that an Islamic country that is an Islamic regime that's incapable of providing its people with opportunities and with the growth that the country requires, needs an external enemy, or several, to actually sustain a security situation within the country and then run the country based on an emergency, a state of emergency. And that's actually what the Iranian regime has been very good at. I would say among the 200 nations in the world, if there is one country that deals well with conflict and with crises, it's the Islamic Republic of Iran. It's had so many times, they've been undergoing different crises. And one of the reasons for the current standoff is they want to sustain this crisis. And they would welcome a precision attack on their nuclear facilities because actually it took them a long time and a lot of money to build those facilities, but now they've learned how to build it cheaper. So the only thing that they need is a good excuse for keeping the country a little bit more secure and in a security situation, and then rebuild everything now with the excuse of, oh, we've been essentially attacked, we're going to we're going to step out of the NPT, and we're going to actually do this the right way this time. Okay, so Iran as an ideological state and as a rogue state is generally an absurd notion. So anyone who actually knows Iran and knows the internal politics of Iran, it's all about economic power, it's about financial power, it's about resources, it's about pragmatism, and it's all packaged within an Islamist package, but nobody within the system really believes in that. People who would be fundamentalist Muslims and really believe in God and whatever comes afterwards would not be stashing millions of dollars in bank accounts because, if you think that's wrong and someone's going to actually make you accountable for it, well, you wouldn't do that. And still they do that. So and that includes even the Supreme Leader and his son. His son just stashed away around £2 billion, British pounds, which was confiscated by the British government a while back. So one of the things that Iran has seen is Iran has learned from its environment. In 2002, Iran offered a grand bargain to the United States, not very formally, very informally, and the person who thought that was totally absurd was Dick Cheney, throwing that all away. Now, his point was, we didn't get an official offer from Iran, and how dare the Swiss ambassador provide us with a piece of paper with an offer that doesn't say who the offer is from, and it's really not formal, no formal letter. Well, Dick Cheney doesn't understand Iranian politics. You don't put these things on a letterhead. This is not the Middle Eastern culture. You just don't do a pro forma of everything and have a 17-page offer and then counter offers and drafts in red and then Microsoft Word drafts. It doesn't work that way. You provide, if the paper has made it to the Swiss ambassador, it actually means it's from a source that can negotiate. And it's an opening for negotiation. This was after September 11th, and the neocons were actually thinking of reshaping the region a bit. And they were also hot on Iran. It seems that Iran was also maybe partially instrumental through Mostashari to shift the attention to Iraq. So there was the Iraq War. And what Iran saw is the fact that if you say, I don't have anything, I don't have any weapons of mass destruction, like Saddam used to say, you're going to get attacked anyways. So the best thing is actually to go on the offensive. The Syrians, for instance, every time they were being accused of being rogue, they were trying to actually demonstrate that they're not. So they would negotiate, they would have, like, their foreign minister was very well spoken and everything. The Iranians actually learned after the Clinton era that being called rogue is actually perfect. It's the perfect strategy because you can actually act in any way you like, and you can say, I can't help it, I'm rogue. Right? So you're not responsible for any kind of actions. You can say today, I agree to this, and tomorrow say I don't. So it provides you with a lot of flexibility. And the Iranians are using that up to this day. When I was at the United Nations, someone in the Secretariat was asking me, what does this letter mean? And they had printed a letter with 17 17 spelling and grammar mistakes, and the print had gone like diagonally into the letterhead. And they said, a country with 70,000 PhDs, millions of laser printers, how can they write a letter that is, I mean, how can this happen? And of course a lot of it is intentional. Essentially you're telling the other person, you can't use your strategy on me. So Iran essentially found that way to be very productive. So if Iran is not ideological, they are pragmatic. Why are they doing the things they're doing? Because I think it makes sense from a game theoretic perspective. They're looking at their payoffs, they're looking at the situation, they're risking it, yes. But they know what they're doing, they might be miscalculating, but still they think they know the payoffs. So it might be an error in judgment, but still it's not rogue. They're following their own calculations. Does Iran want a nuclear weapon? Iran wants nuclear weapons capability, that definitely. So they want to have a virtual deterrent, they want to be able to switch at any given time to an actual deterrent, if possible. Is that going to be to wipe out Israel? No. Iran has been much more on the, operates more on the fear factor than on an invasion factor. So except for the time of the Persian Empire where they essentially invaded all the other countries, Iran has not necessarily invaded, in the past 300 years, they haven't really invaded any country. So they're not really externally focused. Do they want influence over other countries? Yes, because they think they're great and they should be a regional power, because 5th century BC they were like an empire. I mean, it's kind of some psychological issues remain even with nations. So what would help in negotiations with Iran? 3 things. Iran will not negotiate on the nuclear issue. They will drag on negotiations on the nuclear issue. They will use that time to develop the capability of developing nuclear weapons. They will probably not go over the threshold of actually building or weaponizing the program. The cost would be too high. And they would kind of just stand on the verge of that step without going forward. But would they be open to negotiations? Yes, but not negotiations about the nuclear program. And that's the wrong thing about when the Supreme Leader says we won't negotiate with America. What they're talking about is negotiations about the nuclear program within the terms that are being discussed are just absurd because that's not what we care about. A grand bargain with Iran contains a lot of different elements, and the nuclear issue is only one element of it, actually not even the most important element. What Iran will require is security assurances. The fact that they are going, their territorial integrity is going to be accepted, and the regime is not going to be overthrown by Western countries. That's hard to do because Libya actually negotiated. They paid everyone who they had harmed and everything, and at the end the US supported the rebels to overthrow Gaddafi. So with that observation, the Iranians are saying, okay, security assurances that these people provide are also not going to be that trustworthy. And Iran then would require to also be recognized as a regional power. There is, regardless of whether, and you can't really stop that. It's a country with resources, and it's a country with lots of human resources, hugely technical population. So it's not to be, you can't really isolate it that much. And it needs to be recognized in that sense. And there must be a way, and this is the most important feature of any negotiation, there must be a way for the Iranian leaders to domestically save face. So Iran was fighting a war with Iraq for 8 years, and the leader of Iran at that time, Ayatollah Khomeini, was saying, we will never stop this war until we win. And what happened is, well, we told them things are not looking good on the battlefield and all that, and within 2 days, the discourse on the Iranian television started to change. And they essentially pitched this as a victory. Well, and why? Because Iran was invaded, and then they said, well, our objective was to make sure that not 1 inch of Iranian soil is under foreign occupation, and we've achieved that objective, and therefore we agreed to peace. But 2 days before that, they were saying, oh no, we need to actually liberate Jerusalem. In order to liberate Jerusalem, we need to go to Baghdad. Their geography was also not that good. But they wanted to essentially make advances in Iraq. And when they saw that they couldn't, and there was the pressure, they essentially gave in. So the Iranian government has shown that at the height of its ideological rhetoric, it's always open to negotiation if the negotiations are the right negotiations. And the nuclear negotiations are the utmost wrong negotiations from a point of premise, this entire terms and issues. These are not addressing at least one side of the equation, is not even looking for any of these. And they will play along. They will play along with this game as long as it lets them get nearer to their own objective. Thanks.
Thank you.
Send the microphone down this way.
Okay, that gives us
I'll stay seated as well.
a lot to talk about. Professor Ferrero.
All right. First of all, thank you everybody for coming. It's great to see this turnout. I'm going to reiterate some of the themes that Ali brought up. If you're looking for a cable news debate, this wasn't the place to come. And those of you that have had me in class, some of the things I'm going to say are going to be familiar, but hopefully this is still worth the price of admission to you, because I believe the admission is free, and if not, Chef, I'd like to discuss my cut afterwards. But anyway, so it doesn't take a PhD to know that Iran is unpopular in the United States. Nonetheless, I spent 2 years writing a doctoral dissertation showing through social scientific methods that Iran indeed is not popular in the United States. That's something I call the Iran narrative exists in our mainstream media and in the public discourse. And it essentially says that Iran is a hostage-taking, WMD-seeking, terror-sponsoring threat that is seemingly devoid of any rational geopolitical interests. Some evidence, just briefly for this, is I noticed that over time, reporting of Iran's support to terrorism didn't actually coincide with actual incidents of terrorism, which would suggest that reporting on Iran has been at many times detached from reality and politically or culturally motivated. And I also find, talking to policymakers and looking at the decision-making processes of Presidents Bush, Clinton, and Bush 43, that this narrative has made decision-makers feel constrained when it comes to deciding how far to reach that hand toward Iran. And some have even internalized these beliefs of the Iran narrative, that Iran is somehow uniquely beyond the pale. One Clinton administration official was once challenged with the question of, hey, we're engaging China, North Korea, why not Iran? And the answer was, we draw the line with countries whose policies are beyond the pale. So look for the book in coming months, hopefully maybe, after when I'm no longer responsible for 4 or 5 classes a semester, I'll be able to get that out. Oh, hi, Dean Smith. So a key point here is that ideas are a major obstacle to reconciliation of the nuclear issue, as well as to other issues. Both sides distrust one another. This cannot be overemphasized. Coercive diplomacy 101. Some of you have heard this from me before. When you're turning the screws on a country, you want to get them to reverse an action. Say Iran is pursuing a nuclear weapon. They use a combination of sticks and carrots. But if you want your target to capitulate, they have to believe that if they make the concession that is being sought, the punishment will cease. Iran does not believe this. Iran does not believe that if they surrender their nuclear program or come totally clean, that all of a sudden the United States is going to be satisfied and let Iran live happily ever after. We have had a thinly veiled policy, official and unofficial, of regime change since 1979. They're paranoid. Some of this paranoia is based in reason and experience, the overthrow of Mohammad Mossadegh. We are somehow going to have to convince Iran that we are not out to overthrow their regime if we are going to see a reconciliation of the nuclear issue. I want to read to you just briefly an excerpt from a book. John Limbert was one of the hostages in 1979. He's an ambassador. He served in the Obama administration as a special advisor in Iran, and he has, in a tongue-in-cheek, laid out the rather perverse and ineffectual rules that govern negotiations between Iran and the United States. First, never walk through an open door. Instead, bang your head against a wall. Second, never say yes to anything the other side proposes. Doing so will make you look weak. Third, assume that the other side is infinitely hostile, devious, domineering, and irrational. It is the embodiment of all that is evil. Consequently, anything the other side proposes must contain some kind of trick. Its only purpose in life is to cheat you. And last but not least, whenever you seem to be making progress, someone or some diabolical coincidence will mess it up. This is the frame of mind that has governed negotiations on both sides. And I argue that, in essence, the United States needs to adopt the lens of realism to understand why Iran might be behaving the way that it is, as well as deconstruct its own mythology, this Iran narrative, that treats Iran as something other than a self-interested geopolitical actor that wants to survive, a regime that wants to survive. If you're not willing to take this approach, it's highly unlikely that you're going to achieve a negotiated solution. After all, it's veritably impossible to negotiate with someone that you see as evil, because nothing that an evil actor does or says can be legitimate, reliable, reasonable, or in good faith. You delegitimize your own negotiating partner, and you make it politically impossible to sell any kind of negotiated solution to your own constituency. So, while a lot of negative feelings might exist in the United States with regard to Iran, grievances about things that Iran has done to the United States and to our allies, and many of those things are rooted in reality, I would encourage policymakers as well as people in this room to separate their normative evaluations of Iran from their analytical evaluations of Iran. Even a broken clock is right twice a day. So it's possible that an actor that you don't like, such as Iran, for moral reasons or political reasons, might actually have a good point or two that we ought to take into consideration. To say that Iran has certain valid arguments is not to bestow legitimacy on them or to be an apologist for them. And while this historical record certainly does contain some egregious acts by Iran, it also includes some acts of outreach by Iran that have been much less publicized in the United States. And I wanted to highlight this Grand Bargain proposal in May 2003 that Ali mentioned that was sent through a Swiss intermediary. Since we haven't had diplomatic relations with Iran since '79, the Swiss have been our official intermediary. And basically what the Iranians proposed, and I've heard from various high-level sources that this did have the Ayatollah Khamenei's at least begrudging blessing. Iran was going to basically put on the table everything we ever wanted from them. Enhance international access to their nuclear facilities, accede to the additional protocol of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. At least, it's probably been a couple of decades now, but many countries that are signatories to the NPT signed this additional protocol that enhances the IAEA's ability to provide rigorous inspections of facilities. So they were going to accede to that. They were going to cease their material support for terrorist groups like Hezbollah and Hamas and encourage them to become exclusively political actors. They were going to step up their cooperation with us in hunting down al-Qaeda, assist in stabilizing Iraq and Afghanistan, and even accept a Saudi peace plan that would have resulted in Iranian recognition of Israel. Now, what do they seek in return? They have their own terrorist group that they're concerned with, the MEK. Of course, they want sanctions removed. They seek an acknowledgement and recognitions of their regional interests. They wanted recognition of their right to pursue nuclear energy for peaceful purposes, and something they've always asked for that we find troubling because it's hard to quantify and operationalize is mutual respect. Iran is a proud country. We tend to overemphasize the role of Islam and underemphasize the role of Iranian nationalism, but Iranian nationalism is very strong. Anyway, the U.S. rejected this. Larry Wilkerson, Colin Powell's chief of staff, has given a lot of interviews on this, and he said that Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld said, quote unquote, "We don't talk to evil." I talked to Jim LaRocca, who's a in the process of doing my dissertation research. He was Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the Near East. He held the only meeting with the Swiss when this came through, and as Ali alluded, it was rejected because it wasn't on official letterhead and therefore was not trustworthy. And I could tell just having this conversation with Oloroko, he was very upset about it. He did not strike me personally as the most open-minded person. So now let's fast forward to 2013. We should not be looking, I've been making this argument since 2009 when the P5+1 process started, we should not be looking singularly and myopically at the nuclear issue, and I want to give you a few reasons why. First, I want to ask the rhetorical question. What happens if Iran ships its uranium out of the country and takes these medium-term steps that would delay nuclear weapon? Do we lift all the sanctions? I find that unlikely because we have a large infrastructure of sanctions in place. These began back in 1995, and they're not all resultant of the nuclear shenanigans of the Iranians. They're resultant of our concerns about their support to anti-Israel terrorist groups, human rights issues. So if Iran demands the removal of sanctions, and we remove the sanctions for nuclear concessions, we still have outstanding issues with regard to democracy, human rights, terrorism. Another thing is that we might need to trade recognition and diplomatic relations for full long-term compliance on the nuclear issue, assuming that Iran wants to have the nuclear option because they're afraid that when the time is right, when we have our opportunity, we are going to overthrow them. Certainly, in this climate, and especially since the 2009 election stolen by Ahmadinejad, it is not a political winner to say to Iran, we recognize your right to exist as the Islamic Republic and have no intention of trying to undermine your regime. Now, if we're going to take that step, it seems logical that we would also in the process try to get concessions on terrorism, other issues that we are concerned about, human rights, democracy. And the final reason has to do with the international community's interest in preserving the global non-proliferation regime. If Iran gets some concessions, some benefits in exchange for coming clean in their nuclear program, we open the door to hardliners saying, well, Iran blackmailed the world. This is what they did. They played nuclear brinkmanship, and they got the West to blink, and they got some special concessions. If instead you put this in a more holistic, all-encompassing context that addresses these other issues that were brought up in the 2003 Grand Bargain proposal, you are obviating that right-wing claim to blackmail. Because if you are getting compliance in the nuclear program, plus support for Israel's existence, plus decommissioning of Hezbollah's weapons stock, if they give us that much, I don't think anyone can say that we succumb to Iranian blackmail. So we should resurrect this grand bargain concept, but do so with clear eyes. 34 years of animosity aren't going to be overcome in just a few months. We need to find ways to give meaning to mutual respect. So there's a lot of work to be done. We have to be patient, and in the interest of time, I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Chris. I mean, both of our panelists are very clear that the nuclear issue is just one part of the discussion that should be proceeding, and perhaps not the major part at all. And I'm wondering, in terms of confidence building, whether either or both of the panelists can identify areas where the United States and Iran have mutual interests and are likely to collaborate and agree on some important international questions. And one that I'm aware of, and I'd like to ask their reactions and see if they have others that they could suggest, is the situation in Afghanistan. At the time that the U.S. expelled the Taliban from Afghanistan after 9/11, Iran was very cooperative in working with the United States. I don't think this has been highly publicized, but the United States and Iran have a common interest in having a peaceful Afghanistan. Afghanistan has a major border with Iran. The Afghanistan and Iran speak basically the same language, and they have worked together to improve Afghanistan. And today, to my knowledge, Iran has important development programs in Afghanistan and is working side by side with Americans in various areas of social development for the Afghans. Can we build on a mutual interest of that sort? And are there other mutual interests that either panelists could identify that would give us a road into negotiations and discussion with Iran that could be fruitful? Who would like to go first? Please.
Okay, sure. So, as you said, probably one of the funniest things in the universe is when two countries are the most hostile countries and one country actually takes it on themselves to eliminate the enemies of the other country to the extent possible. So Iran had the two enemies on two sides, on two borders. In the west, they had Saddam Hussein, and the U.S. took care of that. In the east, they had the Taliban, and the U.S. took care of that too. And so there's, of course, a lot of basis for collaboration because the people who are currently in charge in Afghanistan and in Iraq are actually Iran-sponsored. So they are Iran-supported, they're Iran-sponsored. So and Iran invests quite shrewdly, I should say, in its foreign policy. And it's very rational. I wrote in 2003, when I was actually, I think, potentially your age, I had this, we had this big MIT Iran analysis quarterly, which I was the editor of, something like your journal, a student-run journal at MIT. And an article that I wrote on Iran, the pitfalls of the nuclear temptation, looked at the nuclear issue from an Iranian perspective. And what I argued in that article is Iran is actually very rational in its investments. Iran is currently paying the administrative costs of President Karzai's office in Afghanistan. So the U.S. is paying to keep the country safe. Millions and billions of dollars are going different places. Iran is paying $1 million to the president's administrative operational issues known to the U.S., and the U.S. knows that, to support that. The U.S. cannot do that. So Iran is actually if the president of Afghanistan wants to do something that Iran doesn't like, his office administrative budget is going to be cut by 70%. And of course, you can see how they're leveraging $1 million per year compared to hundreds of millions of dollars that the U.S. is spending. So they're generally rational. Would they be working together in Afghanistan and Iraq? Nothing comes free. So Iran is not willing to do goodwill building by doing these things free. So first, should the U.S. and Iran reach a grand bargain, then I'm pretty sure Iran and the U.S. will collaborate on many, many different issues, including narcotics, including Central Asia, including issues within stabilization of Syria and other places. Iran has acted very pragmatically in all of its external relationships. It's supported, in Syria, they're supporting a secular government, which is the Bashar al-Assad government, against Islamists. But they're an Islamist regime. Now, there's a difference between the types of Islam that they have. Some of them are, the Islamists those are Wahhabi and Sunni, and the Iranians are Shia. But actually, they've been known to support Christians over Muslims. So like in the struggle between Azerbaijan and Armenia, Iran took the side of Armenia. So it's essentially, they took any side that they think makes sense for them. They will do so, however, not out of goodwill, because they tried that and it didn't work. I don't know whether you might be aware or not, it was too hectic at the time, but in the aftermath of September 11th, very spontaneously, close to 10,000 people in Tehran gathered with a vigil candlelight for the September 11th victims. The government did nothing to stop that. It didn't organize it, but it didn't stop it either. And it was covered on Iranian TV, which is quite rare. So there was a very strong expression of sympathy and support for the victims of September 11th. And that's what they got in return of actually doing some goodwill gestures, like handing in some high-level operatives of Al-Qaeda to the U.S. and helping them in Afghanistan in the initial years after the invasion was not necessarily returned by the US, by the previous administration. So that has resulted in them wanting things in return before they actually do any kind of collaboration. Chris?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, hard-pressed thinking about confidence-building measures that we could turn to. I feel like the ship has sailed on Afghanistan and Iraq. It would be nice if we could get Iran to rein in Maliki a little bit. Things in Iraq aren't going very well. As far as confidence-building measures are concerned, I think something that would be helpful, operating from the premise that Iran is concerned about its survival and would like a nuclear capability to ensure its survival, would be for the United States to just change its talking points, its rhetoric, because tone matters a lot, particular to the Iranians. Our politicians feel pressured to say that all options are on the table. We use the language of sticks and carrots. Iranians respond to the carrots are for donkeys. It is an insult. This is something that came up in Khamenei's statement today, that it's foolish to think that you can mix incentives and disincentives. So I think something the United States ought to consider doing as a short-term confidence-building measure would be to change its language to say that the United States is committed to a negotiated resolution of the nuclear issue, and to resist the pressure to say that all options are on the table. Let Bibi Netanyahu say what he wants to say. We're still the United States. We need some political courage from our leaders. With regard to more tangible areas of cooperation in the region, just thinking beyond Iraq and Afghanistan, one of the rather vague requests of the Iranians in the context of a grand bargain would be a greater role in regional peace and security. I think this is very challenging because we would have to bring our regional allies on board. The Saudis are not fond of Iran. And neither is Israel, of course. The Gulf Cooperation Council is a body of Arab Gulf sheikdoms that was formed largely as I don't want to go so far as to say an alliance against Iran, but as an alternative to Iranian prominence in Persian Gulf security. So as we explore confidence-building measures of a technical security nature, we'll have to also bring on board our allies. This isn't just a choice that we have to make, but we also have to sell this to our allies, and that adds to the complexity of it.
Do you see some opportunities to do that, and what form might a new regional alliance take?
Haven't given it the thought, and I haven't heard any detailed expositions of that, and I see Ali shaking his head. I do want to make one more point that...
Which way is he shaking his head?
The regional alliance thing with Saudi Arabia and all that, that's not going to happen anytime soon. I mean, that's
Okay.
Now, I also just want to make the point, I don't know if we'll have another opportunity to bring this up. I find the timing of the latest nuclear talks to be a little bit peculiar, and as far as the genesis of some new plausible confidence-building measures, we have a leadership change coming up in Iran this year. Ahmadinejad's term will expire this summer. We're going to have a new Iranian president in August. I think it behooves us to wait and see who that is. It's also worth noting that Khamenei, he seems pretty vigorous still, but he's getting up there in years, and he is the decider in Iran. Ahmadinejad is overrated in terms of his capacity to make decisions of national security and war and peace. Keep your eyes open, too, on the election in 2014, next year in Iran, for the Assembly of Experts, which is the body that chooses the supreme leader. The presidential election in Iran later this year will be the big shiny object that the media is focused on, but arguably the more important election that will give us a hint as to what types of confidence-building measures would be plausible will be this composition of the Assembly of Experts, because probably sometime in the next decade they're going to choose the new supreme leader.
Well, I mean, one of the aspects of this that strikes me is that we recognize the fact that there's a new regime that will be coming into Iran, but not until the summer. We have a new regime that's coming in today. And wouldn't it behoove us, to have this new regime of president in his second term, entire new cabinet, new leaders in the State Department, new leaders in the Defense Department, wouldn't it behoove us today to set out on a new path at this time? And if we did, how might we do that?
Again, as I said before, the path has to. I think the problem here is Chris and I are resonating too much. We need to find some areas in which we can.
I'll be Bill O'Reilly. You don't know what you're talking about.
But essentially, again, we need to go back to the grand bargain plus. So the grand bargain in 2003 wasn't sufficient, but it's actually quite interesting because Iran not only said that they would back the Saudi peace process, but they would actually recognize the state of Israel. Should the Palestinians accept if the peace process, what they essentially said, the way they framed it is, we will support whatever the decision of the Palestinian people. Which, if the Palestinians came to peace with Israel, that would mean the recognition of Israel. So there need to be a couple of issues that are going to be done. From now until, I agree with Chris that the election of the next elections, in particular presidential elections in Iran, are actually not going to change, they're not going to determine Iran's perspective and Iran's approach to negotiations. So it's not that a new president has the authority to actually negotiate something if the Supreme Leader doesn't change his mind. However, the Supreme Leader, despite the fact of being the decider, doesn't make decisions on his own. He's very much informed by the people who are around him. And the people who are around him can give him very different perspectives and influence his perspectives in very different ways. So if they can pitch a negotiation in a way that, again, is face-saving and seems Iran, but makes it seem as if Iran was victorious in its standing up to the West, then it is possible that you can actually make a grand bargain successful. Something that Iran really does not react well to is being treated like a child with carrots and sticks. So they really deem whether or not they're correct in wanting that, they want to be considered equal negotiation partners in any kind of interaction.
Given the history of the past 8 years or so, the American public have really been conditioned to be very hostile to Iran. So how would either of you see something positive go forward that would be acceptable to the American public?
Well, why don't you talk about it?
Profiles in Courage. It's a thin book, but it's time for a new chapter to be written. It takes presidential leadership, and one of the things that is different now with the second Obama administration, you mentioned we're at that moment, compared to the first, is that the failure of the talks in 2009, 2010, where social scientists would say overdetermined. There was the 2009 election. There was also Republican efforts to undermine President Obama and do virtually anything possible to assure his defeat in 2012. And so it was not politically astute for Obama, especially after the 2009 election in Iran, to invest a whole lot of political capital in trying to sell the notion to the American people that, yeah, but we need to reconcile with them. Presidents tend to have greater leeway in their second terms, and presidents tend to spend more time on foreign policy in their second terms. So I think it is, to a large extent, incumbent on President Obama to stand up for analytical sensibilities and to break the grip of this Iran narrative. And there is precedent for it. From what I understand and what I've read, China was tremendously unpopular and was characterized and demonized in ways during the 1960s, the first couple decades of Mao's rule. And then when Nixon opened to China, it was fairly short order. Once our administration set a new tone, the American people got in line with that. So it'll take leadership, and it's possible. I'm not going to bet a lot of money on it happening. But.
I think the analogy with China is a very interesting one. I might just share with you that I was in Afghanistan at the time that Nixon landed in China, and when I was working under a USAID program, and we were under instructions from the American ambassador not to talk to the Chinese. If we met Chinese representatives in meetings and social activities in the street, we were to ignore them. And we did that. It was a very strange thing to do. But then when Nixon landed in China, in one day, it all changed. And so perhaps that could happen with Iran. I think it's probably a good time to open this up to questions, and I'm sure many of you have something that you'd like to propose to the panelists. Yes.
You guys write some paper. I was wondering if I could direct you to talk about more what are the possible repercussions of the current U.S. policy if we continue to enforce more sanctions, or even if it comes to attack Iran's nuclear facility, what would be the fallout from that? From like how would that change Iran's stance and how that would affect us?
The question is, if we continue with more sanctions and hostility and perhaps overt military action, how might that play out? You've already indicated some idea about how this would play into the hands of the current regime. Would you like to comment further?
To be honest, within the next 3-4 years, I don't see the military option as ever taking place. I mean, I just see it as infeasible. There's a lot of threat. Something to know about Israel is Israel never warns for 5 years, I'm going to attack, I'm going to attack. When they want to attack something, they just attack it, and then they essentially later on, they say, okay, maybe we did it, maybe we didn't. It's not that they're going to do a PR kind of thing for 5 years. Let us not attack. We're going to attack the spring. This is the red line. This is the Acme bomb. You don't do these things. Essentially, you go for it. You do it. You don't ask for permission, and then afterwards, you deal with the consequences. So it's unlikely that Israel will attack. It's also unlikely that the U.S. will attack. I mean, we had a discussion before because of defense cuts and everything. If you're already in 2 wars and you're stretched thin, and then your DoD has to essentially cut funds, you don't go into a major war. And Iran is would be the most major war the U.S. has fought since Vietnam. So it wouldn't be Iraq, it wouldn't be Afghanistan, it would be very different. So no, I seriously doubt the military option is going to take place. But I do think that the administration believes that the sanctions are working. I would actually agree with them that they're working because they're essentially putting both the government of Iran but also the people of Iran under a lot of pressure. And the thing is, I would have preferred for the sanctions to target the government more and the people less. Right now, Iranian students in the U.S. Are not able to have bank accounts where they can transfer money to pay for their tuition, and that makes no sense. They can't take the GRE exam because that's sanctioned. It might lead to a nuclear bomb. So essentially, there is a lot of the approaches are somehow impacting the Iranian population where they really shouldn't. And the rationale for that is actually amongst most countries in the Middle East, the Iranian population is one of the most pro-U.S., pro-American populations. The government is very hostile, but the general population is very sympathetic to the U.S. So it makes no sense to actually undermine that positive perception. However, sanctions seem to be working in pushing the government to change its behavior in one way or another. It's also creating a lot of internal factional fights between the different parts of the Iranian regime. Unlike North Korea, where you have a very clear chain of command, in Iran it's not that way. The power centers in Iran are numerous, and they interact. And the figurehead, the symbolic figurehead might be the supreme leader, but the supreme leader does not have all the power in the country. There are too many. One of the reasons it's very hard to understand who's doing what in Iran, it's the center of powers of plenty, and their behaviors change and their allegiances change, and that's what changes also the dynamic. So what I would say the consequences of continuing the current policy is the Obama administration is effectively waiting out to see what happens if they turn on the screws on Iran for so long without necessarily going to the next step until there is an internal breakdown. within the country. And I think that's currently the objective of the Obama administration, is just wait it out until either the Iranians come up with a totally new offer and kind of give in, or that they have an internal breakdown. I think that's what they're seeking.
Chris, I'd like to comment on that too.
Yeah, as far as the consequences of a military strike, you disrupt the economy at least for a couple of weeks. You would strengthen the hardliners in Iran, undermine the green movement, the reform movement. We would probably see asymmetric retaliatory strikes in the region, attacking our interests, our forces, even our allies in Afghanistan, Iraq, certainly Israel. It's not the best choice. As far as the consequences of not attacking, of just living with the status quo, I'm going to say something that a lot of politicians can't say because they're really important and I'm not, I guess. We can live with the status quo. Iran has been 5 years from the bomb since 1992 in American intelligence assessments. We are living with 6 North Korean nuclear weapons, as far as the latest assessment I've seen. We lived for half a century with the Soviet Union. Many people in Israel are content to live with the status quo in which they have to carry a gun over their shoulder when they go to 7-Eleven. We can live with the status quo, and the sanctions are working. Don't mistake my comments that we should engage Iran in this grand bargain framework with the notion that we should just give up the sanctions right away. Iran's demand that sanctions need to be lifted before there's any progress, that's a non-starter. They're shooting themselves in the foot if that's the position they're going to take. But Hillary Clinton has said some things and then walked them back earlier in her term as Secretary of State about extending our nuclear umbrella to our Gulf Arab allies. And if you're operating with the premise, as I am, that Iran is a rational actor that is primarily interested in self-preservation, I think they're deterrable. And I don't think that they are looking to actually fully complete a bomb and build it and put it on alert. They want to have the latent capability so they can marshal a bomb within a few months. We could be having the same conversation in 10 years. I wouldn't be shocked, and I don't think it would be a tremendous threat to our national security. Israel, we'll talk about a consequence. If we don't act, how long can we keep Israel from acting? And when they do lash out, how do we deal with that mess? And how much of the blow